Good morning, all. Thanks for being with us again. This is Thursday, the final day of our conference. Almost midday, so good midday to you all. Today is the final day of our conference, as I'm sure you know, and we have two sessions we are excited to share with you today. For anybody who has not met me on a previous day, my name is Ruth York. I'm the Executive Director of the Idaho Federation of Families. And this is a conference in collaboration with the Department of Behavioral Health, the Division of Behavioral Health with the Department of Health and Welfare, who give us the funding for a parent education conference annually, which we greatly appreciate. A reminder, stay with us for this afternoon's parent panel at 1 o'clock. That will be our final session of the conference. And a good one, I think. And then after that, we will just do a few tie-up things for our conference, including acknowledging those of you who have been very active throughout the conference and networking with each other, which we want to really be able to continue, and we can talk to you about how that can happen. So let me start by introducing our next speaker. His name is Dr. Ryan Billington. He's a psychiatrist who is an Idaho native. And with the exception of some time in Washington State and California doing college and med school and part of his residency, he's been in Idaho most of his life. On an interesting note, he likes to be active in water on a bike and on a longboard. So that all sounds like gobs of fun to me. He enjoys home projects that involve some creative designing. So essentially, we've got an all-around talented guy with us this morning, it seems. Dr. Billington, thanks so much for being with us today. We're excited to hear your thoughts on framing a child's distress and behaviors to a physician. And let me hand it over to you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me to this talk. And hello, everyone. I'm still adjusting to giving talks over Zoom, but I welcome your interaction with me throughout this talk. If you have questions that come up, you're more than welcome to type them in the chat. I have my phone up and hope I will be able to see that as it happens, but would also welcome other people highlighting the questions that popped up as it happens. So I have the chance to talk to you today, and I hope that this is both simple in the takeaway points that I present, but also can go as deep as we'd like it to, because in the end, our ability to do this, to frame distress, describe behaviors, deeply involves how we are in ourselves, and that's somewhat infinite for how we can go into it. But I'm really excited to talk to you. And yeah, let's jump into it. So this is framing a child's distress and behaviors to a physician or a PA, a physician's assistant, or an NP, someone in healthcare. My goals that you walk away with a way to think about problem behaviors in kids. This is true in human beings, but want to focus specifically on doing that in the role as a parent or someone who's responsible for a child. I'm going to talk about this biopsychosocial, spiritual way of thinking through problem behaviors or distress. And then I hope that you feel empowered for a way to use this to actually talk with a physician or healthcare provider. And then we'll have about 20 minutes at the end that I hope to leave fairly open for exploration, discussion, or I can always go off on some of my favorite ideas about creating mental health in all of us. So glad that you're all here. So I want to just start out with an introduction. A lot of us are not really familiar with what exactly a psychiatrist is. Even my own family members sometimes refer to me as a psychologist. But just to be clear, a psychiatrist is a physician. It's a person who went through medical school, and that physician is supposed to have special knowledge and education and ways of helping people in matters of the mind. the brain is the organ that sits in our skulls, but the mind is something that we're still struggling to understand with science. It's produced by the brain, but is significantly more than that. It's the place where our emotions and thoughts and personalities and motivation and all sorts of patterns related to a way of being in yourself and how you relate to people and the world sits and lives and breathes in a very real way. So as a psychiatrist, I went through medical school and then a 4-year psychiatry residency. And during that residency, a psychiatrist receives a lot of medical training, obviously, as a physician, but also studies talk therapy. I happen to study 12 different types of talk therapy formally. And the goal with psychiatry is to really have this 10,000-foot view of how someone's behaviors, lifestyle, medical conditions, the experience of being human, normal human suffering, all comes together, and then to have a bridge treatment that takes illness-creating patterns in those things and moves into health-creating patterns. And all of this is done around things that are called psychiatric diagnoses. And psychiatric diagnoses are named problem patterns, symptoms or signs. And these problem patterns interfere with someone's quality of life, how satisfied they are with their life, or their ability to do things that matter in life, to function. And that problem pattern is not normal in a way. It's difficult for any of us to sit with anger and work through it, but anger is not a psychiatric diagnosis. Anxiety is not a psychiatric diagnosis. Those are parts of internal experience that can be hard to move through, hard to deal with, hard to use to enrich life. I often introduce myself as a trauma psychiatrist because of my focus during residency on how really awful things early in life changes how people create a sense of self, how they relate to other people. In psychiatry, these are called personality disorders, but psychiatry is still working to have meaningful ways of naming trauma patterns in people. And that's where I get really excited about trying to help people come alive. So today, what causes my kids' problems behaviors? How do I make sense of this? And how do I talk to a physician about it? Well, I want to start off with something really clear. This will be the most important point and the take-home point, that all problem behaviors in people should be seen as signs of distress. So if you see someone and their behavior seems weird, I want you to be able to think of that as, oh, this is the person's behaviors trying to tell me that they're having trouble meeting underlying needs. We'll talk about those needs in a moment. But behaviors can be anyone's voice, but especially a child's voice or a teenager's voice to seek and meet needs, particularly unmet needs. So you may have seen one of these signs, but instead of help wanted, the help may not be wanted. I'm going to replace this with a help needed. Anytime we're seeing these problem behaviors, it is likely that someone could be using some support to meet their needs. So what needs am I talking about? And this is where this biopsychosocial, spiritual thing comes in. This is a way that psychiatrists try to understand what's going on in human behaviors. what could be the cause of these behaviors? What could be the cause of this distress? And there can be biological causes, psychological causes, social causes, and spiritual causes. Now, all of this is a little bit of a false construct, but it's a really useful one. It's a really useful way to think through what's going on in a human being. All of these causes can interact, all of them can overlap. And so I want to show you some things where if you just type this into Google, biopsychosocial, you'll find models that look like this and images that look like this, which I think are really useful. So you can see and get some idea of what are we talking about when we talk about biological causes. That includes, like I said, anything that relates to me physically as a person. I'm a person that lives in a body. So what is affecting my body? What's going on inside of it? And that can be everything from the way that people sort of misunderstand that psychiatric diagnoses are not chemical imbalances in the brain, but there's something going on that's affecting the brain and how it's working that is different than normal, that is creating these rigid patterns of illness. So how do we understand that in someone? And I really like these areas that overlap, the orange, the green, and the purple, to understand there are things that sit really solidly in both of these, where someone's temperament, something that makes you who you are, your personality, is core to both your body and your mind, and is affected by both. I think it's really easy for us to think through, if you and I have not physically eaten in, not had any food in 18 hours, then yes, it will affect our bodies. Our bodies will be weaker. We won't be able to, say, run as far as quickly. We might start getting low blood sugar. But it's also going to affect our minds. It's going to affect our emotions and what we feel. And if that becomes significant enough, it may affect our ability to interact with our environment or interact in social situations. So I really like this, and I'll keep coming back to essentially what is an exercise in imagination and creativity for appreciating how each of these areas can affect a person. Now, why include the spiritual in this? Well, because there's something, and I think we can all relate to it, that is more, we could put this in psychological if you want, we could put it in social, but things like something like becoming a mom for the first time, or the death of a loved one, something that reaches really deep into this sort of essence of what makes us human and affects it. Yeah. And so we could describe that in terms of beliefs, behavior, emotions, and personality, but there's something more. There's a few questions that I've gotten in the chat. So before I move on to our next diagram, do psychiatrists do hypnosis too? Yes, they can. Hypnosis can be essentially a way of trying to move into deep relaxation. So less the hypnosis that we're seeing at the fair and more a practice of using the mind to create relaxation in the body. This can also be called something like mindfulness, would have a similar effect. Even how I breathe. Breathing is a really interesting thing. In both, we do it without thinking about it. There is an automatic trigger for breathing, but I can also consciously change how I breathe. And so something like that is special for being able to notice how my choices and my intentionality change my experience of my body. You might say that hypnosis is a guided way of moving through that process. Don't psychologists do talk therapy too? Yes. I talked about what a psychiatrist is, but a psychologist usually has some sort of doctorate degree, a PhD or a PsyD, specializing in, could be anything. You could have a psychologist that specializes in research, that is interacting with companies around marketing stuff. You could have a psychologist that specializes absolutely in talk therapy and does not have the medical background or training, but is focused on how relationships can heal people, and has special expertise in that area, as well as social workers or counselors in talk therapy. Yeah. So this is just another diagram. I really like this one because of how everything is sort of floating around. For some reason, this appeals to me a lot. Physical health, metabolic disorders, immune distress, genetic vulnerabilities, comorbidity, how things synergize in the body, and how these things synergize in psychology or in a social environment, like how rich someone is and what school they go to or what peer group they hang out with, how family circumstances and culture can synergize into some of the most powerful social habits that we do, and how that changes how we move through things like trauma or grief or our usual pattern of relationships. So I hope this is making some sense at this point. This idea of you have a body, you have a mind, and you have an environment and an environment of relationships. And then something, this aspect that is difficult to describe, but I'll refer to as spiritual, that has to do with the essence of being human in all of these things. So, how would you think through framing distress in this way? Well, we could do it with me right now. I've been thinking about this talk for a while. You might say I feel some sort of anxiety or hope in interacting with you, but there's also a sort of responsibility. So if I notice my body and check into my sensations, my stomach feels a little bit light right now. I may be talking faster than normal. My voice may be different. But practicing noticing these aspects and what could be going on in them in human behavior is really helpful. I gave this example earlier, but let's say you and I have not eaten for 10 hours. You know, where could that show up in these areas? You know, what could that manifest as? How would we think through the patterns that could come out of I haven't eaten for any length of time? And it's amazing to me. I don't have kids of my own, but when I watch my brother and his wife with my 4 nephews, the way that they can almost reach into the future and intuit what's going on with their kids and problems that are going to come up soon or likely to come up soon. Human beings are built to do this. It's a huge part of what drives who we are and how we interact with each other. And so this is just a sort of thought structure, a cognitive structure to do that specifically. But with kids, a huge mistake, and I'll move into this in the next slide, is focusing on any of these in isolation. And that's the danger when going to talk to a physician, is that only one of these parts gets isolated without appreciating how it's interacting with the other pieces. You know, like let's say a kid goes to school and discovers that the person they thought was their best friend has actually been mocking them behind their back. And recently, the same child had a conflict at home with a sibling and felt a sense of shame, felt, you know, maybe did something, broke something, acted out, emotions took over their body in some way. And they had this sense of maybe I'm not in control of myself, maybe no one will love and accept me in certain circumstances, you know? And so how could this show up? You know, how could this show up in a specific environment at school, at home? Yeah. And how do you talk about these patterns? And that's what this construct is a way of trying to think through and talk about those patterns. So I challenge you to play this what if game often with these areas to think through what you can think about might be happening in you, in the people that you know well, and start to notice these areas, and you'll start to notice patterns in yourself or in people you care about. What you do with those patterns is really important relationally. We'll talk about that at the end, but practice getting curious, practice being aware and thinking through, using your mind to work through what could be causing distress, what could be causing unusual behavior in people. So, yes. Examples gone wrong. Let's say, again, I have nephews. So let's say one of my nephews is visiting me, has a terrible stomach ache, and I take them to a physician to get checked out. But I fail to mention that my nephew has just started school and is struggling to make friends. You know, that could completely shift the way that you and I are thinking through these problem patterns. Or let's say a family member is visiting home when these stomach aches are happening, or that every time my nephew has a stomach ache, I go out and I get him a special blanket and specific food, and we spend the day connecting. You know, what is my response when this happens? Let's say I get angry and yell, you know, what am I doing in response to this? Not just focus on the kid, but focus on what's happening around the kid as this problem behavior or this thing happens. Could keep going. Maybe grades were released at school last week, or there's a test that's looming in the near future, or that someone in the family died or was recently hospitalized and is now home. That could be a communicated medical illness. That could be all sorts of things. But I hope the idea of this biopsychosocial thing is starting to set in at this point. Let me know if I'm still missing the boat. Well, let's say that they also have stomach aches, but they have a rash that you just started noticing on their back. That'd be really important to include. Or if they've had headaches, or if this has happened before, or if it's brand new. Maybe the child had an experience with bullying several months ago, you know? Yeah. So what now? What do you do with this construct? And I tried to outline it here in a sequence. The first part is the hardest part. It's getting curious. It's practicing thinking through this and shifting your focus of attention to take in these possibilities of what's behind human behavior. So get curious, you know, interact with whoever it is that's in distress. And they may not be able to tell you. They may not know what's going on in them that's causing distress. It's amazing how each of us needs space to make sense of our experience in relationship. That's a core part of what psychotherapy is allowing people space for discovering the pieces of themselves and what's happening. I take notes. I'm a note person. So if you notice these things, try looking for patterns of what happens, because the patterns are usually going to be consistent. I mentioned behaviors are to fulfill needs. And so these behavioral patterns will come up as needs in someone come up. And try to notice those things by category if you can. Now, physicians don't have a lot of time, unfortunately. So I would highly encourage, just like I practice this talk, to practice sharing what you're noticing. Practice sharing these patterns and try to prioritize your concerns so you feel clear going in, this is what I want to communicate. and I'm hoping for this sort of category of a way forward. You know, it could be a clarity, it could be confidence, it could be what to do in case of an emergency. And then I hope that you walk away with a sense of movement, a sense of what is the plan and how are we moving forward? How is this problem changing in the process? So it could be that you're highlighting specific things to your therapist, you're highlighting specific things to your physician, to your child's physician, to your child's therapist, that you're leaving space for your child to do that. To maybe if you have a teenager, that you're leaving space for them to get to do that work and you're not doing it for them. And then really clear, if something starts to become unsafe, not just my feeling of anxiety, but what am I looking for? What are objective signs that things are moving in the wrong direction? And what do I do about those now for right now safety concerns? Yeah, so that's an emergency plan. And then what's long-term? What is going to be a process through which we're moving together? So that's most of what I wanted to share for how to think through this. And this is, I hope, where things get interesting. I'm going to stop now before I go through the summary and look at some of these questions. Question. So how do you determine if your kid needs to see a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a counselor? Which one is considered a therapist, or is that something different too? So there are a huge variety of specialties that can be called a therapist. Psychiatrists can do therapy. I studied, again, like I said, 12 types. But because of pressures of the system, because I'm a physician, often systems will put pressure on psychiatrists to do the meds piece, which I think is a abhorrent thing. Because again, psychiatry is supposed to have this 10,000-foot view and be helping all the pieces come together. Making sure that was not the hospital. So in anyone who can be a therapist has a specific training to gain licensure in as a, for example, a licensed clinical professional counselor, an LCPC. Or in social work, you can have someone who has a master's in social work, or someone who is a licensed clinical social worker. So these are just differences in experience, training requirements. One of my favorite books on psychotherapy is written by someone who is, his name's John Fredrickson. The book is called The Lies We Tell Ourselves, and he just has a master's in social work. So when people say therapist, they usually mean this catch-all term for, could be a psychiatrist, could be a psychologist, could be a social worker, could be a licensed clinical professional counselor, and so on and so forth. The important thing when knowing this is, what's the problem that you're seeking for counseling? If your kid needs to see someone, what's the problem there, and what is the person's training for addressing these areas of that problem? If you go to a psychologist and you're really wondering about how a medical piece could be affecting these things, a psychiatrist might be more situated to do that. But not all psychiatrists do this very well. Some psychiatrists, I want you to walk out feeling like you're learning and you're part of the process, not that you've been branded with a sticker. On to the next question. Don't psychologists do talk therapy too, or is that different? Yes, a lot of people can do talk therapy with a variety of training backgrounds. Why is it so much easier to get an appointment for a medication before a proper diagnosis is made? Waiting lists apparently are so long for, a variety of different diagnoses, including autism. I just actually participated in some research on this. Psychologists and psychiatrists are two groups that have the longest duration of training. It is a group of psychiatrists that writes the DSM and tries to define psychiatric diagnoses in a way that helps healing happen. So when it comes to diagnostic accuracy, I would say psychologists are the best at that, using a full panel of tests and all sorts of things that involve statistics and statistics in responses. That is a science, where psychiatrists are ultimately, it's always about what's practically helpful now for helping someone heal. That's the difficulty in psychiatry, and the art is taking that diagnosis that is most useful for helping healing happen. But if you go to 8 different psychiatrists, you could walk away with a constellation of 8 different diagnoses. The question is always, how useful is this diagnosis for creating healing? The beauty with medications is that they can have a significant impact, and they are very easy to do, start, and monitor, where sometimes the availability for a talk therapist or someone who has expertise, the emotional energy of finding a relationship in which you get to do that work is hard. It takes building something. You're building a relationship in which healing happens. But almost all psychiatric conditions, I'm just going to say all because it's useful enough, all rigid problem patterns, which are what psychiatric diagnoses are benefited by if there is a medication that has an evidence base for improving things in the condition, specifically symptoms, function, quality of life, and then supportive relationships. And I'm going to come to that in a bit. I have a diagram that I use frequently with patients. So in summary, the take-home points for this are that all behaviors in people, if you see it and it's standing out to you, like, wow, that's odd, please think of this as a sign of distress, especially in kids who are learning their bodies, they're learning their emotions. They need this modeled in relationships to be able to do this well, and they need your help to sort of absorb the violence of life so that they can connect with themselves and connect with this part of themselves that's trying to come alive and is showing up as distress. Distress can be caused by these different areas or needs. You can think of these as factors. I like thinking of them as underlying needs in each of these categories. Observe carefully, get curious, get support in doing this. This can be, I hope, fun, even if it's frightening. It can be exciting, even when it's really sad. There is a way to connect in the process, and I hope that this increases space for creativity for you in the process. I wanted to go into this because there's just some things about being human that are hard to talk about. I mentioned that I'm a trauma psychiatrist. They say trauma is when your mind struggles to differentiate between a memory, between something that lives in your body and affects all these other areas, struggles to differentiate, to tell the difference between a memory and an event happening again right now. And that trauma heals through being able to make sense of what's happening in me now, and through a sense of agency, empowerment, a way to do something where previously I felt helpless, powerless, was in that fight, flight, freeze reaction. But in agency, I'm not just a reaction, I'm a person, and I get to choose. Validation, I have a slide on this. Validation is the behavioral skill set that conveys worth. And being able to see the parts of someone changes how they get to interact with it. That's the power of diagnoses, being medical or psychiatric. If I can name it, it changes how I get to interact with it, how you and I get to interact with it. That's the power of language, right? You know, if I'm like, hey, the squirrel is climbing up the tree over there, you know what a tree is, you know what a squirrel is. We get to have an exchange around these because you understand what I'm seeing and you're like, I can see that too. So the trick is, how do we take those skills and move it into people and say, you are seeing a squirrel, you are seeing a tree, you are feeling angry right now. I see that in you. I notice your body and how it's moving. Is this what anger feels like for you, in you right now? But being able to acknowledge these parts really eases distress. It helps so much to be seen, and it's the starting place for connection. We all feel shame. I don't want to think what my mind is spewing out half the time. It's amazing because English is incredibly, we are gifted by our language structure for noticing cause and effect. We do blame really well with the structure of English. So people who are English speakers have a natural ability for noticing cause and effect. But it's really important to understand that people are not the parts of themselves. I don't pick what I feel, I pick what I do in response to it. I don't pick what my mind is thinking, I pick what I do in response to it. And that's the difficulty about becoming a person, is accepting and then practicing, what do I do in response to these parts of me that are alive that I don't control, but I get to use in a way to create life. So in this way, no human experience is alien to us. No need is alien to us. You and I might have different personalities or different values. We may move through conflict differently. We may show kindness differently. We may love each other differently, but we all have a need for connection. We all have a need to be true to our values, or we will suffer. We all have a need to move through loss processes. We all have a need for making sense of what's happening in me or what's happening in the world around me. So you being a person, you practicing these skills and being able to do this in yourself will increase the way that you can notice it in your child and support your child noticing it in themselves. That's the fundamental basis of what makes people people and how people develop a sense of self. This is especially important with emotions, because if I'm just a reaction, you know, how many of us are we set off by rage? A lot of us, because when we feel rage, how many of us had the experience of someone being in full rage mode and my emotions matter just as much? So you have to be able to emotionally regulate to practice awareness and be more than reaction. And emotion regulation is necessary for connection. So just to reiterate that point. This is something from a type of psychotherapy called dialectical behavior therapy. And this is that skill set, behaviors that convey worth, validation. The first being looking interested and paying attention. The second is an awareness of what the other person is saying or doing, being able to reflect back and notice these things. And then we're starting to get into the parts that we're talking about today. This ability to go beneath to what's not being said, to understand what is integrating a person, how their thoughts and feelings and the environment and all this stuff is interacting and makes sense in them as an individual, and then would make sense higher level for anyone in a community that that person belongs to. That's the fifth level. And the important thing to understand is that this is all sequential. If I'm not paying attention to you, if you don't have a sense that I'm actually looking interested, this is the power of attention to shape human behavior. If you don't have confidence that I'm aware of what you're doing or saying, if you don't think I'm listening to you, and if you don't think I understand you, it doesn't matter if I'm doing the highest level of being genuine with you and being open with you. So you'll be like, oh, you don't care to understand me. So I hope in this talk, the reason I included this is that this is a way to value your kid. Even if it's distress, even if it's something that the kid really does not want, because shame is terrifying. Showing interest in what's happening in someone and helping them discover it without condemnation, without judgment, is core to this. And I hope that you get support and get to have that same experience with your physician, with your child's physician, to explore what's happening in your kid, what's happening in you in response to your kid. This is the way I talk about active mental health creation, but I want to move on because this is a very complicated slide, but I hope this helps make sense that we have a brain over on the right that is producing thoughts, some of which are good for solving problems and some of which are not so good for solving problems. Minds try to solve problems. Thoughts are problem answers, you might say. But with thoughts, we have these core things that make us human. Core needs that all human beings have, core values to who you are. That as those things come up in the moment, it drives the emotions that we experience in ourselves. And emotions are such a gift because they tie us to the actual experience of being alive right now. And emotions are literally behavioral programs. They are meant to prompt action. But as you and I can become aware of how sensations in our body can be named emotions, what fear feels like in my body, then I get to start practicing and having this agency. Instead of just reacting, I can regulate and use the emotional information to be more intentional, to do what's fulfilling my needs and bringing me alive. This is a diagram that I use to summarize psychiatric treatment with core areas of how do I take care of myself? That's the personal strengths category. How do I connect and find people that are helping me take care of myself, helping me come alive? Meaningful supportive relationships. What am I taking into my body that is helping me do all the other areas that I believe is, helping with symptoms, quality of life, and function? And then what I'm taking into my body, is that worsening my problems? Is this an escape mechanism? Am I trying to numb or avoid things? Because if I'm trying to run away from myself and my life, I'm not going to get very far. And notice I include psychiatric medications in that substance intentionality. People will use psychiatric medications to try to kill off parts of themselves, and it's never going to work if you do that. Well, it won't work. Never going to work if I try to do that, I should say. So that's it. I want to leave the last 15 minutes or so for a sort of open exploration of things. I brought some of my favorite books on parenting, but just want to open it up for questions and have a bit more interaction. Thank you so much for letting me chat with you today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that. I just found that very fascinating. And I just want to say really well-paced and structured and put together. And thank you so much, because I feel like a lot of people have gained a lot of value from that this morning. I do want to encourage people, throw out names of topics that you'd like a little more information on. Dr. Billington's already told us that he's got some books he can share with us that he believes could be helpful on our parenting journeys. So I'll let him share those in a minute, but this is your time. with him to throw out any further questions and or topics, because I think you can tell this is somebody who can just take a topic and go for a while and share some valuable information. So take advantage of that. Maybe you could start by sharing those books you were talking about.
So I also want to say these slides will be available later.
Yeah.
If there's anything in the talk that you want to be able to remember, I'm happy to go back to it now, but this will be available through the website as well. So thank you so much to all the staff for the support. Books, okay. I mentioned this silly diagram that I use. The technical term for this creative awareness of parts of being a person, thoughts, emotions, wants, what are my desires, needs, and actions, is called mentalization. And it's really cool because mentalization is the best evidence for long-term relational satisfaction. It has the best evidence for preventing divorce. It also heals trauma patterns. It is a treatment for borderline personality disorder. It is a treatment for burnout. If people can be aware of themselves, their ability to endure stress goes up by 400%. Now, we didn't know this 30 years ago, but people were talking about it. And this is a classic book. Let me see if I can not blur my screen. It is by Adele Faber and Elaine Maslish, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. There's adult versions of this, and I'm sorry for the blurriness. How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. And this was written back in, I think, the 80s or 90s. I really like it. There's little cartoons that people feel. I may try to stop my screen blur to see if this makes it a little bit easier. All right, so yes, this book is great for practicing these things around communication. If you want to get more into the science of this book is excellent, The 6 Needs of Every Child. And it goes over the sort of science of connection and relationship in a way that's great. I talked about validation. This is my favorite subtitle on any book. The Power of Validation. I'm going to see if I can read this to you. Arming your child against bullying, peer pressure, addictions, self-harm, and out-of-control emotions. How to raise an emotionally confident, stable, and self-reliant child. Best subtitle ever from a single skill set. Yeah. This is my favorite book on grief. It's called Read This Till You Believe It. So sometimes there are things that happen in life, and I may not be willing to accept people in my family. I may not be willing to accept the parents that I have, or the child that I have, or the family that I have. But my hope is that, that moving through grief in a specific way can help us accept what is actually in our lives.
Will you say the title of that again? It cut out just a little bit right as you said the title, and I'm going to repost that.
Definitely. The title is Read This Till You Believe It by M.H. Clark. I mentioned that I'm a trauma specialist, a personality disorder specialist. If I could pick 2 books for people to heal from awful things in relationships, these are the 2 books that I would pick. This one is called Recovering from Emotionally Immature Parents. It's by Lindsay Gibson. And it's excellent for being able to see these patterns and how they affect it. I hope when you read this, there's these things where you have this moment where you're like, oh yes, I know that. Because most of us experience relationships, be it with a boss, with friends, with things like that, that don't make space for us. And then This one is excellent. It is called Self-Care for Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. I think I could work on this skill set, all of it in these books. It has categories of protecting and caring for yourself, be true to yourself, practice emotional self-protection, honor your inner world, and nurture your emotional health. Section 2 is dealing with people. Section 3 is coping with challenges. I can probably work on this skill set for the rest of my life. So I hope there's a lot of things there. There's other books. One I like is called How to Be Miserable and things like that. But these are the books that I thought might be really pertinent to this opportunity I had to chat with you all.
All right, folks, do we have any topics or questions that we can throw out? I'll ask you about a book while we're waiting to see if anybody will throw that out. And that is, it's been very helpful to me and people I know. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. What do you think about that one as helpful and for parents of kids from trauma?
Yeah, I really like it. I like it a lot. It's largely regarded as perhaps in the top 3 books, best written books on trauma. So yeah, I think it's exceptional. I really like that he's somewhat critical of psychiatry in this area, because psychiatry needs to do better, says my mind. I think mental health needs to do better when it comes to trauma. We'll get there eventually, but man, it sure feels for me like it takes a really long time. So yeah, incredible book. I'd highly recommend it.
I'm interested in, since I'm sure you travel in some national circles, what I found, and my parent journey was a while back, but when I was living in the West throughout raising my kids, and finally, when my child that I was really seeking the most help for was 15, somebody finally said, I think trauma and attachment issues are involved here. So it's all like, nobody had ever been willing to say that because he was adopted very early. And he didn't hit that 2-year mark that they used to say, oh, if you got him before 2 years, everything's fine. So, then somebody finally said, look, you know, it looks like this, it presents like this, talks and feels like this. Let's just call it this, shall we? And from there, I was able to then go to some conferences, do some research on trauma. What I found was the eastern part of the United States seemed far more advanced in their knowledge and thinking and interventions for trauma than the Western United States. And I'm wondering, I get this sense that that is still true in some ways. Obviously, people like you help the Western United States, but is it more rare here in the West to really have knowledge and understanding of these things on the level that we should? Is Idaho a trauma-informed state, would you say?
Idaho is absolutely not. Between this Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Alaska region, we have some of the worst mental health outcomes in the nation. We have the least number of mental health providers. We have some of the worst suicide rates. So it is sort of commonly held in my field that Idaho is about 20 years behind for standards in mental health. If I go to Seattle, that's different, but that's just Seattle. If I cross the mountains and go over to Ellensburg or Yakima or Spokane, then yeah, so it's not just Idaho, but there is a huge disparity in different parts of the country for a sort of awareness, space, and functioning systems to help people move out of these things. The hard thing with trauma patterns is that they pass on. It's really interesting to look at history from World War II. and how people came home, dealt with that trauma by pouring themselves into work, taught their kids specific things about how to deal with life, and that at some point, these reactions of trying to move away from the most difficult parts of human experience get rigid, stuck, they don't really work, and is passed on to the next generation. That's why I get so excited about mentalization, because mentalization stops that generational trauma transmission. But if you and I can't mentalize, if we can't be aware of these parts of self and practice that agency, we pass on the trauma patterns that we were born with, that we remain unaware of, at a 75% rate. Now, doctors don't understand the genetics of that yet, but that's actual science. So good news, absolutely people can hear. Bad news, unless we do this really hard work, we keep handing the problems down the line in a way that echoes in a very real way. I would argue that, thankfully, we're becoming more informed and we're having more conversations about this, but I don't know of a human being that hasn't been affected by these things. I would argue that 85% of mental health relates to these deep patterns, and physicians and psychologists, we're all trying to find the most helpful way to talk about that, and that takes time. So I hope you get to find those conversations. I hope this presentation helped with you having those conversations. And yeah, I welcome your reaching out to me, but I really appreciate getting to be here and share with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have one other quick question, and then I'll make some comments and close out. What is the best way to find a trauma therapist?
Yeah, so it's really important to understand that in dedicated trauma therapy, there's something called evidence-based treatments for trauma. Trauma patterns will get worse before they get better. Anytime I have a behavioral pattern, if you try to change it, I will increase the intensity of that pattern rather than give it up. So if you're trying to change trauma patterns, they're going to get more intense before they change. Yeah, this is the whole idea. We know this about our bodies, right? If I want to get stronger, I actually need to work my muscles out, and they'll feel weaker before they get stronger. It will hurt, you know? So this is just part of healing in human beings. So I encourage anyone, when you're seeking out a trauma therapist, to ask really directly, like, what's your training in understanding trauma? How do you orient that? How do you understand that? And there are specific therapies that have an evidence base with trauma. But in the end, any relationship in which you can do that mentalization will help you heal from trauma. So be intentional if you move into dedicated trauma therapy to know things are going to get worse before you get better. You need a skill set to protect your quality of life, your function, and to be aware and absorb worsening symptoms or signs that are related to those patterns of dysfunction to move through trauma therapy well. It's hard. It's really hard work. So go to therapy. Build your ability to be aware of your emotions. Build your ability to take care of yourself. Practice treating yourself like you have worth. And at some point, if you're like, man, I still feel like there's these patterns that I'm aware of, but they're running in me, they're taking up an energy, and I don't want them to have that much energy, I don't want them to have that, then seeking out specific trauma therapy. But really, it's going to be calling, asking, and being intentional in understanding what is this person's training and what is their ability, how do they think through and approach this, what are the names, and yeah, there's always the internet for looking at names of therapies. It doesn't matter, they all work very similarly, but it all comes back to, can I be aware of those parts of self? Can I have a way of making sense of this? And can I find an agency that I didn't have before?
Thank you so much. I think that point of it's going to get worse before it gets better is so important, because we're already under such duress as parents oftentimes. And then when something starts going even further downhill, that's the fear point. That's a really easy time to abandon something, because, oh my gosh, it's not working. Things are getting worse. So that's a really important point that you shared. We are at time. I want to thank you so much. I think everybody out there will feel good as I say, we will not end our conversation and relationship with Dr. Billington here. You are really speaking to people who want to know what you have to say. The Idaho Federation of Family would love to give you further platforms for sharing your thoughts with us. I feel like this has been really, really valuable, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys get to enjoy the panel in the next hour.
Yes, so that will start at 1 o'clock. So people get a chance to feed and water yourselves, answer a few emails, whatever else, walk the dog. And please be back here at 1, because we do have 4 parents who are doing a lot of advocacy work and who have a lot of lived experience at home with kids with serious emotional disturbance. And so they, I think, will be a really valuable group for you to hear from as we end our conference in a little bit. So we will see you back at 1 o'clock. And again, thank you, Dr. Billington.
Thank you.